Hello and welcome to the Property Trio, the podcast for the sophisticated property buyer. I'm joined, as always, by my fabulous two co-hosts, Cate Bakos and Mike Mortlock. How are you both today?
Good, loving the intro. It's great.
Fabulous, I guess.
We need some sort of moniker, don't we?
Yeah, why not?
So today's episode is listener questions, and we've got two great listener questions to dissect from two long-time listeners. The first one, who prefers not to have a real name used, so we'll call her Marilyn. Just made up that name on the spot. Not a common name anymore, is it?
I'm loving your form this morning, Dave. All right, Marilyn's question.
Yeah, so Marilyn, that's right. So Marilyn's question is, how do the trio think the suburban rail loop and proposed density increase in a 1.6 kilometre radius around the new stations will impact existing property prices? And also to our question of, do you have any feedback for us? Marilyn says, show is great, thank you. So always love to hear that. So the suburban rail loop. So for our non-Victorians and possibly even some of our Victorian listeners, I'll just provide a little bit of context on what the suburban rail loop is. So it's a major public transport infrastructure project, a train line. It's designed to connect Melbourne's middle suburbs, reduce congestion, and provide better access to public transport. So one of the frustrations of many Melburnians is to get from one part of Melbourne to another part of Melbourne. That north or south mightn't be that far away, but you have to catch a train all the way in to the CBD, get off, get onto another train, and then head back out again. So what this is trying to do is sort of wrap around the middle suburbs, starting in the east of Melbourne, working its way up the northeast, then jutting left or westward, I should say, cutting across the top of the middle of the northern suburbs of Melbourne, back around via the airport, because one of the another long-held frustration of Melburnians is no train.
You're about to say an election promise.
Yeah, or election promise.
Election promise, same.
Same thing. Has been no train line given the size of our cap city. There's actually no train line to and from the airport, and then wrapping back down to the western suburbs of Sunshine. So that's the plan in a nutshell. It is the most expensive infrastructure project in Australia's history, which, as you can imagine, has caused a lot of controversy. There's been arguments that it hasn't been properly funded or planned for. We don't know how we're going to get all the money. People are worried how pressure that's going to put on the governments, on taxes, on so the economic justification, whether it's there or not. There wasn't a lot of discourse with the public about it before it was announced. So it has started being built, and one of the arguments also was, or the reasons for building it, was to reduce congestion in the CBD, which actually is not that much of a problem anymore, because we haven't had people going back to work in the CBD anywhere near the pre-COVID levels. So there's actually a lot of push on from businesses and office tower owners based in the Melbourne CBD to get more people into the city. So that's, so this arguably is going to take more people away from the CBD. So for perspective, we're 62% below pre-COVID levels, according to CBRE, of the number of people working or heading into the CBD each day. And on Monday and Fridays, guess what? It's under 50%.
Yeah.
Still, yeah. So, look, that's a bit of an overview of the suburban rail loop. But the question is, how do we think that will actually impact property prices in that 1.6 kilometre radius from those train stations. I think there's 12 of them that are going to be built. A number of them are planned to be underground. So, yeah, what are our thoughts?
Well, I love this question because it doesn't just relate to Melbourne. And sometimes this
Yes.
show gets very Melbourne centric because you and I are Melburnians, Dave. But we've got historical infrastructure projects that we can point to and talk about in various cities. And I'm a big fan of utilising public transport infrastructure and having a better system, because we've had a rail system that was, behind world-class standards for quite a long time. And you've given a really great overview. The suburban rail loop is the next phase that they'd be rolling out. Anyone that's visited Melbourne or lives in Melbourne knows all about the current rail loop project, the Metro Rail Tunnel project, and that in itself has been designed to ease the burden on the existing Metro loop, which was built in the 80s, and it's been great, but it's very dated. And we carry so many more passengers now than what we did when that was designed in the 80s. And even considering the pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic uptake with rail, that was well underway and it was always going to go ahead. And it's going to finish. They're already testing trains now, and it will finish and be ready for us to all utilise next year. And that one links the inner ring suburbs, and they've created 4 brand new stations. So that will be really interesting for quite a few pockets. And I do want to chat about that on the show. But there's part of this question that we got from Marilyn that was specifically about proposed density increases within a particular radius of these new stations or hub stations. And we've seen that roll out in other cities as well. And New Sydney was in the news for a long time and still is, in relation to the planning changes around these centralised areas where higher density development is now permitted. And I think there's a lot of positives in this, but like anything that represents change and has an issue associated with people resisting that change, in other words, NIMBYs, not in my backyard, there's always a bit of an uproar. And the planners put these ideas together to make our cities more livable and to ease the burden of having vehicles on the road. So I think that there's a lot of upside for a lot of property prices, but we should talk about the good, the bad and the ugly, and also discuss what's been happening in other cities. And Mike's certainly got a good handle on some of the New South Wales infrastructure projects as well.
I'm very interested with Marilyn's specific nature of the question, the density increase in a 1.6 kilometre radius.
That's the big that's the big question, isn't it, Mike? What's the impact on property prices in that 1.6 kilometre radius? And there's actually been another announcement by the government recently of about 10 or 12 activity centres or designated hubs so this is the type of thing that Marilyn's concerned about, that the Victorian government's just announced recently, with new housing developments up to 20 stories high will be fast-tracked around these 10 activity centres. And actually one of them's Camberwell Junction. So, and we're about within that sort of 1.2 kilometre radius, actually. So, yeah, it's actually directly potentially impacting us, even though that's not the suburban rail loop, but it's the same basic question of what Marilyn's trying to understand. So,
yeah, I guess the specific nature of the 1.6 kind of does indicate that that's roughly where she is from it. Look, there's all sorts of higgledy-piggledy research around prices and proximity to transport links, but it's impossible to just isolate it as one thing. Like, it's the train station that's manipulating the prices, and the train station's just gone in and there's no supporting infrastructure, because that's the real interesting thing, isn't it? I think employment opportunities have a much greater correlation than the new transport links, unless it's it was a previously very difficult way to get from A to B that's a complete game changer. But it's really going to be what's actually in those hubs. It's not just going to be a train station, as you say. There's the density, the high-rise accommodation. So I would be saying, look, if you have something that's comparable, like a high-rise apartment in that sort of location, there could be some competition in the short term. But I really think that we're at such a supply dearth that it would be short-lived. But unless you're in direct competition, I would expect these hubs to be quite thriving little pockets of that suburb. So you're going to have the coffee shops and the cafes and the news agents, and there might be medical centres and childcare centres. I would assume that there's going to be a residential and commercial mix in many of these places where they have the space. I think the proximity to...
Well, more businesses are going to pop up, aren't they? Because there's going to be more people requiring services.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a gentrification thing that should actually benefit the local suburbs.
I sort of agree with you, Mike, but I do challenge the question mark around, how exciting a train station on its own could be, because I'm witnessing the premium that someone will pay to not have to take a car to a station and battle for a park. We've got stations in Melbourne's outer west that are a bit useless from that point of view. If you're not at the station by, 7:10, you won't get a park anyway. So, of course, there's no incentive for them to catch the train. They'll just sit in the car park of traffic and nudge their way into the city and continue to have congested roads. I know when I'm working with particularly the inner ring and parts of the middle ring, especially in the east, where you've got a high proportion of white-collar workers that do want to get into town, they will pay a premium to be within walking distance or an easy little tram commute to a station so that they can get to work without having to take the car out. And in some of our inner ring areas where we've got some of our wealthiest households, they have 0 car or 1 car in their household, and that's deliberate. They want that lifestyle. People value their time like never before, and they do not want to be spending it commuting to work.
Yeah, and where I was going to go to next was it depends on the specifics of that particular location as to what value the transport hub brings. So, for example, if you look at suburbs in Sydney like Newtown, there's really not that much off-street parking, and a huge cohort don't actually own a car. So the distance between where they live and the train station is kind of disproportionately valuable. Whereas if some of these locations are typically houses that have, double garage and maybe a spot for a boat, and these people typically would be driving to the areas that they work, let's say around Broadmeadows. I know there's a lot of sort of industrial things around there. That's probably not going to be as important as some of these inner ring suburbs where people do actively commute into town every day. So my point is that it's not going to be a uniform positive or negative across the board. It is going to sort of vary from point to point. But I think anytime you get above sort of 40 minutes commute time, there is this kind of psychological problem for people. People don't want to be any further away from the city to be able to commute to their place of work in a time frame that's more than that. So that sort of comes into play as well. If there are certain spots where there are suburbs, as you say, Dave, because it sort of skirts around the city. If there are employment hubs around there, and previously people would have to drive and battle for parking, or they'd have to come into the city and then go back out, there'd be a huge benefit if there are employment hubs around that kind of periphery.
Yeah, and I think, look, most of these stations or suburbs where they're putting them in, particularly for the suburban rail loop, are those types of, they're already those sort of hubs.
Yep.
So they're already sort of, mini cities, if you like, or, places where there is more commercial infrastructure, more workers. So it's probably only going to just add to that for these locations, these 12 locations. The other thing too is because they are middle suburbs, they're all within 40 minutes train ride to the CBD. Now that doesn't mean, going from your house to the train station, getting on the train and then getting to the CBD and then walking to your office. That might still take 45 minutes or even slightly longer potentially. But the actual train ride, is probably going to be something like 15 to 20 minutes from most of the locations. I think to one of the points you've made, Mike, it will, like if Marilyn is thinking about a property she already owns that's within 1.6 kilometres, it will probably depend on the type of property she's owning. I think, if she does own an apartment, it's likely there's going to be an uplift in the number of medium to high density apartments built, and that won't be good for the capital growth of the apartment if she does currently own a relatively new apartment. And potentially the same could be said for townhouses, because it's likely there'll be more townhouses built. Whereas if you've got a standalone home within that distance, that may not be particularly on good land. That may not be impacted quite as much. It might even make that more valuable, because it's going to become a scarcer resource over time, and whether that is, for someone to live in or even as a development opportunity. So, perhaps we could unpack those line of thinking a bit further.
I think it's a development opportunity, right? If you've got a parcel of land within a tight radius of that hub, and the local planning controls are increasing the density, then you could be zoned something that is, standard residential to a high density residential, and with a stroke of a pen, your value can increase. But I agree, Dave. I was just kind of thinking, look, if they're going to 20 stories near these hubs, anyone that owns an apartment in a 20-story complex in any of these areas is going to have some more competition. But not knowing the areas very well, I don't see that much sort of high-rise 10, 20 levels outside of the CBD in Sydney, apart from, South Bank, which I sort of equate to the CBD anyway. Yeah, in Melbourne.
Yeah, that's right. They haven't quite got those built up mini cities like the Chatswoods and the Bondi Junctions and Parramatta in Melbourne. And these are the type of things that, might be catalysts for it. But,
we can think, talking about Footscray, we've just got a sea of cranes on the skyline there. I know it's only 5 kilometres out, but that's a case in point. We've seen a lot of things happen in Doncaster,
is like a mini city.
Yeah. And I know the Camberwell people are, there's a lot in the media about how people feel about higher density in Camberwell, but, it's an obvious.
And that's like just 2 5-story apartments or 3.
NIMBY city.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you do think around here for the development being a hub precinct, in terms of there's some beautiful streets within that 1.2 kilometre radius. So this isn't the suburban rail loop, but it's a similar thing with these 10 hubs that they've said they'll increase the density. I think on those streets, it'd be interesting, I just don't think you're going to get away with putting something up that high that in some of these beautiful old streets. It's just not going to get through. On the main 3 streets that run through the Camberwell Junction, sure. It'd be hard to imagine it getting up to 20 stories like you have in Box Hill. But it
happened in Box Hill, and Box Hill once had that high street character of similar, nothing's quite the same as Camberwell. It's a really beautiful, interesting junction, but who knew that Box Hill would get so dense? And you just have to take your parent through these places when they haven't been there for a while, and they're just, gobsmacked that such change has rolled out over recent years.
Sorry, Kate.
The question of 20-story buildings and beautiful streets, it is an interesting one that you raised, Dave, because as much as these new ideas and local government changes will be able to push back on NIMBY people who don't want something in their backyard, they will always be cognizant of overshadowing and privacy issues. That's always a key requirement of planning controls, to make sure that someone's natural light and their privacy is considered. And you hear your sad stories about owners that have that taken away. So it does happen. But I think for an area like Camberwell, there'll have to be a lot of consultation and a lot of consideration for those attributes.
I think some of the streets that are, say, 1 street back that do have the beautiful old apartment blocks that are already there, that are sort of 2 to 3 stories high, they might be more at risk of having new developments built in them because they've already got an apartment block in their streets. So, if you own a house in that street, you might have some more concerns around that. But again, that might push up your land value if you did want to sell to a developer.
I think it's important to think about the incentives and what the government is actually hoping will happen. This is a huge amount of expenditure, and we can see the tap on, tap off data. This is going to be reported. They want this to be a roaring success. So they've presumably selected these locations because they are kind of either employment or hubs where people live or work. But they're also going to want to encourage development around those hubs, right? Where they want an efficient flow of people, from this station into the city or wherever they're going. So I can't imagine that government wouldn't be quite sort of unrestrictive in terms of the development that they're going to want to put in there. Of course, there's always considerations, the streetscape, the privacy, the shadowing and those sorts of things. But I would expect a reasonable amount of mixed-use development in and around those hubs. And that's going to create employment opportunities. So I think it's going to be a net positive in general for people in and around these stations. It's just if the new development somehow mirrors what's existing there, or the new development somehow encroaches on what was existing there, that's where you can get the negative impacts.
Yeah, agreed. And we're talking about suburban locations at this stage, and Marilyn's question was all about that, and I think it's a great one. Let's talk about the impact of new stations closer in. And I've seen several of our cities introduce new train stations into inner locations, and Melbourne's doing it as well. If we consider anyone who's familiar with Melbourne, when you're driving down St Kilda Road, that actually has its own postcode, 3004. And there's approximately 10,000 residents in that St Kilda Road stretch within that postcode. They've always got the trams rattling past, but they're getting a new station, and that's called Domain. And Domain is interesting. I don't imagine that everyone will just flock to that station because they would rather catch a train to the city than a tram, although it will be faster. It's the connectivity that train station has with the other new stations. So, for example, Parkville, which is a medical precinct, and it's also home of Melbourne University, and it's close to a lot of things that
Princes Park.
Yeah, people have relied on tram for all of this time to get up there, and now they're getting a train station. So think of every medico worker or every person who has any affiliation with the university or Princes Park, anything in Parkville, they can get to Domain Station and get there very quickly. That's a game changer of a commute. And likewise, we've also got a new station going in Arden, which is closer to North Melbourne's heartbeat than what the current North Melbourne station is. For anyone who's familiar with Melbourne, North Melbourne station currently is closer to West Melbourne, and it's not a short walk into Errol Street. And Arden is not only a new station, but it's a new precinct. So they've already got a lot of off-the-plan sales taking place, and it's been converted government-owned and industrial land that's going to be a new suburb called Arden. So there's a lot in store for these inner areas in Melbourne, and I question what that will do in a positive sense for residents who live in these areas. And, Kensington is a case in point. South Kensington is a sleepy little station that a lot of the commute time trains just whiz past. It's not a hub station, but it's going to be a hub station, and it will be connected to these other new stations. So what will that do for Kensington? It will not only allow those residents to utilise up to 3 train stations, Macaulay, Kensington and South Kensington, but it will also mean that they're connected to this new metro loop. So I think there's a lot in store for Melburnians who are connected to these new stations. 10,000 residents in postcode 3004, that's a big bonus for them. So, I think it's going to be interesting.
And I think if you boil it down to that sort of primary, what is the type of property you own in that location, I think if you own standalone houses, it's probably a net positive. Yeah. Townhouses, it could be positive, it could be negative. and apartments, if you own a reasonably new apartment built in the last sort of, 5 to 10 years, it may be a negative for you. One thing we did, so with the location app that we built about 8 to 10 years ago, that had would track the 60 to 80 data points when we'd review locations, when we used to provide that service for our clients and their properties. One of the things that surprised me is, and we actually nicknamed them huburbs. So these suburbs that were around a shopping centre or a major shopping precinct. So internally we nicknamed them huburbs, and I was actually surprised how positive their long-term capital growth was. So, certainly from the analysis we've done internally, suburbs or huburbs that have had this type of infrastructure built over a long period of time and have tended to outperform.
Yeah.
There you go. Good news for Marilyn, I think, depending on what she owns. Is that a summary?
I think there's a lot of benefits across the board. And Dave, your comment about apartments is absolutely noted. If you're in a high density area that gets even more high density, there's always that scarcity factor that you're wanting to consider. But I think questioning the amenity and what will draw more people to an area, that's really the heart of this question. And I'm really hopeful. Optimistic is a better word, for the impact on prices for people that will benefit from these better commutes.
Yeah. And you think of those inner suburban ones, Cate, you've talked about. One, a lot of those locations people travel to for, nice restaurants, cafes, pubs, etc. And it is a frustration, having to try and get there via public transport. You'll pay for an Uber, so making it easy to get there by public transport will certainly add to the activity in those locations. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah,
and make it more livable for a lot of people.
I agree. Not everyone who has a white collar job works in the CBD. We've got a lot of employers on St Kilda Road, for example. We've got a lot of employers in Parkville. And then we've got a lot of employers at hub stations that are, further out, whether it's west or north or southeast. And so some of these new stations will allow people to get to their point of employment without having to trundle into the city. And that was what it was all about.
Yeah. And again, that adds to livability, which adds to property prices.
Yeah.
Cool. Look, good discussion there. So we better get to our second question from Hunter. And Hunter asks us, if you had 500K to the good old question, if you had $500,000 to invest right now, where would you buy in Melbourne or / Brisbane? And if you had $1 million to invest right now, where would you buy in Melbourne / Brisbane? And in the question for feedback for us on how we can improve the show, Hunter said, love the content. Keep up the great work. Thanks,
nice.
Hunter.
Wow.
So where are you going to tell Hunter to buy, Cate?
Well, I do love this question because I get it a lot. And it's really interesting that when people are asking me, should I buy in Melbourne or Brisbane, they don't understand that I'm not a borderless investor advocate. I'm strictly Victoria. I have to say to them I'm the wrong person to ask because my answer will naturally carry bias because I'm running a business. But the question back to Hunter and to anyone who asks this question, why is this race only out of Melbourne or Brisbane? And I say that because I very rarely get someone saying, should I buy in Melbourne or Sydney? Or should I buy in Melbourne or Adelaide? Or should I buy in Melbourne or Perth? It doesn't seem to happen. It's the dominant city that we seem to come up against for investors is Brisbane. Dave, why do you think that's the case?
It's a good question. I think for some reason, Brisbane and Queensland and southeast Queensland, there's this belief system that it's a great place to invest, probably because it has the fastest growing population, I'd say. Then I think overlay that with climate and then emotional drive to potentially want to live in a warmer climate yourself. I think a mixture of those factors, maybe recency bias might be coming in terms of the Olympics, in terms of escapism because of what happened during COVID. Yeah, what are some of your thoughts?
Maybe price points. For a while there, we had similar median prices.
Price points.
As
yeah,
you know,
it's a good one.
Our mix of houses and units, that ratio is very different in these two cities. So maybe that's a flawed argument. I've always wondered, though, why is it Melbourne and Brisbane and not Melbourne and something else?
I think
Mike?
I think the media is probably weighing into this somewhere somehow. Perhaps it's like, where do we buy in Brisbane because it's still humming along and it's potentially not at the top like Adelaide or Perth maybe, but, you know, I don't want to go out and say Perth's at the top. I think it could still go a lot longer.
We're staying away from that today, aren't we?
Yeah, it'd be nice for a change.
Until it goes backwards for 7 years. No, I'm just joking to everyone who's listening who really barracks for Perth.
We can't joke about this stuff, Dave.
14. Let's get some proper hate mail. But I think there's a fair amount of interest, and if you take the pulse of, say, the Facebook property investment forums, Melbourne's definitely getting a lot of attention because it's just a matter of when rather than if the market bounces back. So I think that might be kind of what's at play here in the question. It's like, you know, where would I buy if I want a proven performer that's still maybe going a little bit, or where do I buy if I want to get something in the sort of Warren Buffett, you know, being greedy when others are fearful sort of vein. So I think that's probably where it's at. Like a bit like what Cate said. I feel like we need a disclaimer before we attempt to even answer some of these questions to say, well, what's actually best for you is more important than what the hotspot is, right? So it's a matter of, is this your first investment property or is it your fifth investment property? Are you 18 or are you 60? You know, I feel like you've got to do the work to understand, well, how does this actually fit in with what I'm trying to achieve? And then kind of reverse engineer the location back from that strategy. So that's not like, that's a painful answer, right? No one's going to be happy with that. I feel it has to be said.
Well, you know, we should hire you as a property planner, Mike. So, I mean, that's exactly where I was going to go. And I think periodically, like every 30 episodes over our 260 episodes, we take the listeners to this point. It's exactly that. Like, is it your first property? You know, is it your fifth property? Where do you own your existing properties? You know, do you have a plan for where you'd like to live long term? And if you haven't bought a house, maybe it's better to own in that location just to ensure you keep track with the capital growth of that location in case the other city or state you purchase in underperforms relative to where you ultimately want to buy your home in. There's all those types of questions and conversations that need to be understood first, Hunter, before you can then make the decision. And the same goes for the price point, whether it's 500,000 or $1 million. You know, how will this property purchase impact your next property decision? You know, what does, to Mike's point, you know, what is your long-term property plan? What is your goal at retirement from property? How far are you towards hitting that goal? You know, all those things need to be unpacked.
I think
I could definitely have a crack at answering this as an example question when we make a few assumptions. You know, we could overlay some conditions and say, well, you know, let's look at this and say that Hunter's looking for the best capital growth performance that the property will muster, and cash flow is zero issue, not a problem at all. So it doesn't matter if the yield's super low or the yield's really high. Hunter's just looking for capital growth. We can answer it in that context. But I also want to overlay distance, because managing a property at a longer distance is more expensive. And I don't care what anyone says about getting a great property manager and setting it and forgetting it, because one day it needs maintenance. Unlike a parcel of shares, it needs a repaint or it needs new roof sheeting. And I'm living all of this right now as a property investor, and it's expensive. And getting someone professional to do it from afar is not always that easy. You know, timing doesn't always work out. Sometimes they'll gouge you, they'll quote you something ridiculously high because you're an out-of-towner. It's really difficult. So those are some of the considerations that need to be applied when you're considering whether to buy in one city or the other, because the holding costs can really rack up.
It's a good point. It's a very good point. I think It seems like we're avoiding this question, and I'm glad you're willing to take it on with those little caveats, Cate. But I want to sort of echo a sentiment. We were in a conversation with a buyer's agent today that's basically saying we're not going to take anyone on that has a pre-approval under 650. So there is a reasonable argument from a lot of people.
What location are they based in?
Well, any location.
They buy all across the country.
Yeah, they're basically saying across the country that we believe that there's kind of a minimum point where we can find these assets that are a reasonable risk-reward ratio for them. So I kind of wanted to pepper that in. You know, $500,000 $500,000 is a lot cheaper than it was pre-pandemic, right?
Yeah, I disagree with that notion though. 650, I reckon I could grab a lot of past clients, not distant past, recent past, that would talk about the benefit of having that kind of budget. And they've achieved capital growth. Obviously, you're not going to be buying a house in Sydney with sub 650, but there are more markets beyond Sydney. And we've got some amazing regions that have delivered some really strong growth, and not flash in the pan growth. I'm not talking about itty bitty little outposts with, 5,000 people in the town. I'm talking about good regional cities where 650 would get you something pretty good. I mean, I can shop in Ballarat, for example, and spend sub 650 and get a decent house in a decent location.
What comes to mind for me automatically with sort of blanket statements is trying to unpack if there's any biases or what the biases are. So one of the things that comes to mind is, do they have a mortgage broking arm? And then that feeding into the bias, because you want a certain loan size to make the time and effort into the mortgage broking viable. And you don't need to answer that, Mike, whether they do or don't. But, if they do, I suspect that's actually the bias that's causing them to make that decision. And another reason for the bias might be, look, at the end of the day, if they're trying to cover all of Australia, you cannot cover all of Australia. I don't care how big the biggest buyers advocacy is in the country. You can't cover every single location in detail and know it in detail, I don't believe, in the country. Therefore, actually capping it at 650 makes your job easy. You don't have to cover as many locations. So what are the biases inherent in the way anyone is approaching any type of advice, and certainly particularly when it comes to property selection? We know we all have hundreds of unconscious biases. So it's just as a person dealing with another human being and you're paying for advice or getting advice from them, you're just trying to ascertain what are the unconscious biases that might be playing into the advice that they might be providing for you.
All conscious biases, Dave, to your point.
Well, definitely conscious biases.
Are these buyers agents,
yeah.
And I'm not having a crack, I'm asking the question, are they a fixed fee model or a percentage model? Because if they're a percentage model, then therein lies your answer potentially.
There's another reason to cap it at 650.
Yeah.
Look, and so if we go for it, Mike.
Well, I was just going to get us sort of back on track. I've got some data in front of me for a new research project. This is an exclusive for anyone listening. We're going to probably unpack this in a couple of weeks after it's reached the media. What we're actually looking is the locations around the country where listings have increased at the highest rate. And if I sought for the median sale price of sub 500, I only actually really get 3 SA3 regions across the entire country. And It looks like 4 of them are Victorian based. I've got the Grampians, which is probably not Melbourne per se. I've got Gippsland East, Latrobe Valley and Maribyrnong, but Maribyrnong is unit rather than houses where the other ones are. And all of those locations have increased at least 14 to 23% in listings in the last month, as opposed to their 12-month average. So
interesting.
I want to put it to you, Cate, because you know these places.
Yeah. Grampians is a long way away. Latrobe Valley,
3-hour drive, give or take.
So
Yeah,
longer
same as
than
Latrobe Valley.
Absolutely. Yeah, Latrobe Valley is interesting because it, Morwell, Moe, Traralgon, and those areas absolutely exploded during COVID when everyone was escaping because, as we all know, a large proportion of Melburnians who escaped the lockdowns and went regional really preferred something within 2-hour commute. And some of them were prepared to stretch beyond that. We saw people going down to Warrnambool and up into Bright, but the majority wanted to be a comfortable 2-hour commute. And so Latrobe Valley absolutely ticked that box. There was one other that you mentioned, Mike.
Latrobe Valley and Maribyrnong units. Gippsland East, which is
Gippsland
like Sale,
East.
Bairnsdale, Lakes Entrance.
So that's even further. Take Latrobe Valley.
It's after Latrobe Valley.
So these places have a lot more properties coming on the market now for two reasons. Firstly, we've got people returning to the city saying, I'm not cool with this 2+ hour commute. I'll sell and I'll return back to Melbourne. We've also had a lot of holiday houses go on the market because interest rates have bitten.
Tax.
Yeah, and if someone's letting go of something, they'll let the holiday house go. And to your point, Dave, land tax, that's freaked a lot of people out as well.
For lots of people in Victoria.
Out of those 4 locations, though, Mike, the black sheep location is Maribyrnong because it's very close. That's one that LGA actually touches our city. So
but that was units only.
Units only. So the reason why we've had a massive increase goes back to what I said half an hour ago. There is a sea of cranes on the horizon at Footscray. We've seen towers go up like you can't imagine. And Footscray has been rezoned, in the last decade, and there's an enormous amount of activity zone covering pretty much almost all of that big postcode. And so from the river all the way back to the city, out towards Maribyrnong, we've got towers in massive numbers and lots of sales, lots of vacant units, lots of old listings as well. And that is what explains the absolute uptick in units on the market. We've just had massive supply, and it's been crazy because we talk about being undersupplied and building starts being slow, but Footscray is doing all the heavy lifting at the moment, in my view.
So the scope for that is really kind of
looking for opportunity.
Yeah, bargain hunting.
Yeah,
really.
Bargain hunting at the bottom of the market.
Yeah, we're not reporting on areas that are tightly held, which is likely to be an indicator of capital growth. This is more of a bargain hunting, and if you see long-term fundamentals in that suburb, now is probably the time to go on these locations. So it's attacking it from a slightly different angle. So I just thought I'd throw that. I'll chuck it. I'll make some comments on the sub 1 million point as well. But it sounds like all of those are out in terms of capital growth potential sub 500.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, there's going to be just like any location, there's going to be outperforming streets and properties that are the best streets and properties in that city or that region. And so if you look at, say, Latrobe Valley, Traralgon's the major town or city in that region. So, it might be the best time to look to buy one of the premium houses in Traralgon at the moment, given it's in the Latrobe Valley region and has a high number of listings. And, if it's going to be investment property, you're going to be getting a pretty high yield. And some of those locations, Mike, you might recall when you actually did your yield research, some of those locations were in the highest yield locations as well. Now, we know we've tried to educate our listeners that that's often because it's had those locations have had the weakest capital growth over a long period of time. But still, that might be the right strategy for certain investors who can only afford under the 500K mark.
And I want to just circle back to Footscray as a case in point. There are lots of towers and apartments and orientations I wouldn't touch at all. But if you could get something on the river that won't be built out, and you've got really good views and it's perfect floor plan and the building's well run, that could absolutely outperform because there's a scarcity value. No, well, I think you'll struggle to get something on the river, water facing, city facing, with a great floor plan that's new in Footscray that offers all of that as a 2-bedder, but maybe something that's a little bit older, potentially. I'm not endorsing 1-bedroom units for a variety of reasons, but I certainly think that there's value to be had. And when that explosion of construction activity dies down and Footscray continues to rejuvenate itself, I mean, it's gentrifying at a rate of knots, some of those towers will be really well considered. I know, I've heard anecdotally that our government are buying some of the units that are very cheap and not offering great orientations and maybe no vistas. We've seen an uptick in social housing purchases in some of these units, and the government comes in at the last minute when the final units are floating around that no one wants, and they pick them up. I know that sounds like an awful thing to say, but I've spoken to people that have verified that.
Yeah, that's probably the tough part, is to get that sub 500. Just thinking about, say, Latrobe Valley and, or even the East Gippsland, whether you could get a period home or, say, a 70s brick clinker that's unrenovated and largely unloved, but sub 500 in a good street near the main shopping precincts in those locations, or around the Grampians. There's certainly plenty of period homes in Hamilton or Dunkeld or Ararat. So yeah, it'd be. I think you could probably get a decent purchase. Again, you stick to the tried and true fundamentals of getting a good floor plan, good natural light on a good street, close to walking distance to the key amenities, and then, somewhat of an unloved house, unrenovated house, you might be able to sneak in under the 500K mark in some of those regional locations, have a good yield, and, if you've got the cash flow to pay that off, I wouldn't be expecting the greatest capital growth. But, hopefully we've educated our listeners over a longer period of time to understand that. But, it'd be worth a shot, Mike. Let us know how you go. Yeah. We'll report back in 10 years' time.
Well, they do some good wine up that way. But I think if we're talking about in the inner city, it's likely going to need to be an apartment. And we've had a few episodes recently where we've talked about the price differential between houses and units in some of these quite blue chip areas where there are opportunities in and around that $500,000 mark. But we're talking about those bomb-proof 1950s, 1960s build rather than the new sort of shoeboxy stuff, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
I've selected units in the inner ring in Melbourne for sub 500 for clients, and they've experienced growth, and I'm talking about a boutique block. In fact, this question is close to home because I've got a daughter who's just about ready to purchase her first investment property, and she's looking at a 450 budget for a 2-bedroom unit, 1970s style, in the inner ring, and she will be able to do it. And if I'm naming locations, that's a very easy thing for me to do because it's in and around my hometown. Yarraville, Seddon, Newport, Footscray, you can pick up a good 2-bedroom unit under $500,000 in a building that doesn't have a sea of issues. That's an important disclosure to make with these strata properties because the ones with big issues are going very cheap. But it can be done, and that's certainly somewhere where I'd consider spending $500,000 in Melbourne.
Look, one thing I'd say to Hunter is if you can purchase close to the bottom of a cycle of a location versus close to the top of a cycle, that certainly can make a reasonable difference in the capital growth outcomes over the next 5 to 10 years. Now, if you're going to own that asset 20, 30 plus years, that certainly smooths out over time and is less relevant. But if you do purchase closer to the bottom of the cycle, which is at the moment, let's face it, that's looking more like Melbourne than Brisbane, that can make a meaningful difference over certainly the first 5 to 10 years of ownership. If I was going to make a statement, I'd probably lean toward. Now, of course, I'm based here. You could say I'm biased, but I'd probably lean towards putting $1 million in Melbourne at the moment versus Brisbane.
Let's do that. Let's double the budget.
Where would you guys spend $1 million in Brisbane?
I can't say I know it to enough detail to make a call.
Yeah, look, I'm probably on the same page. I couldn't tell you what the median house prices are in some of these locations, but the places like Tenerife. I've seen investors that were getting in there in the sort of like 800s and 900s. Those are well in excess of $1 million now. Those are the sorts of markets that I'd be looking at. But you've sort of got to now look back in time. I'm pretty sure the medians are in excess of $1 million there. But yeah, I'd be looking. I mean, if you can, I'd be looking at houses rather than units, which I think be the advice in Melbourne. Anything that's within a reasonable distance of the city, it's got a good land to asset ratio, and there's quite a few pockets like that in and around Brisbane. But not being an area specialist, it's probably outside my pay grade.
I mean, look, if I was going to sort of have a stab, and I'd say try to get within a K or two of the river in one of those more sought-after suburbs where if you can get in for $1 million into a standalone house, you might have to get something, within a few Ks of the city, sort of that 2 to 4 Ks of the city. That's probably where I'd be looking in around where some of the private schools are located, and that's probably where I would be looking initially, at least, to see what I could afford and get for $1 million.
My Melbourne take.
Yes,
absolutely. $1 million is a challenge and not an impossible one if you're looking at something close into the city that's period. And the reason I say it's a challenge is it's the last kind of bastion price point, but you can manage it if it's a particularly small single front property. Single front means it's got the hallway down the side and the rooms off to the other side. And it won't be 3-bedroom unless it's a wreck, but you could get a 2-bedroom that's neat and renovated if you pick your suburb correctly. And the last suburbs, in my view, that are offering Victorian single fronts at the $1 million mark are Newport and Footscray, occasionally Flemington and Coburg. And you'll pick up something in those suburbs if you look hard enough and it's small enough, and I'm talking about small land size as well. But the key to working with this budget is making sure that it's not so small that it's difficult to rent. You want it to cater to a couple, not just a single. There are other suburbs where you might get lucky. You could see something. Sometimes in Sunshine, there are a couple that will come up, and of course that's a lower price point again. So there are a very few number of Victorians in Sunshine, but you can spot them. That's something that I'd consider targeting. Otherwise, I'd go into the middle ring and target a 3-bedroom house with $1 million, and you'll be able to do that in places like Sunshine. We talked about Sunshine and its potential for growth with infrastructure builds and connectivity to the airport one day, if and when it happens. Places like Glenroy, and then if you swing out to the southeast and you follow the coast all the way down, you could get yourself down towards Seaford and have some opportunity there as well. So there are certainly quite a few areas. You could go southeast inland and look at gentrifying areas like Noble Park, Springvale, and then you can go further out east. You'll have to travel a long way east to spend $1 million and get a home, but I'm absolutely confident that you'll get capital growth because there are still a lot of people living in the outer east. It's kind of the way that our city is skewed. So I really hope that helps our listener.
Well, there you have it, Hunter. Hopefully we've made your decision-making simpler and not more complex, but I think we've given you a lot of food for thought on your property purchase, whether it's 500 or $1 million, and whether it's in Melbourne or Brisbane. So without further ado, I look forward to your gold nuggets.
Now it's time for us to go mining for our gold nugget property tip of the day.
My gold nugget is a little bit pertaining to the point I made below or earlier in the show. It's that the strategy is more important than the hotspot. And, perhaps this is just a thought experiment, but $500K budget, $1 million budget, those are completely different sets of criteria. It's sort of not like, we'll go to the same location, we'll just buy something more expensive. It just opens up more possibilities. So what's more important is to get it right for what you're actually trying to achieve, understand where you're trying to get at the end of your property investment journey. But certainly comparing sort of Melbourne and Brisbane, they're at the complete different ends of the property clock. And just because you've got $1 million budget doesn't mean the best asset is actually going to be something that's right up there. There could be something for 850 that's actually kind of a better property for you, for your strategy, and then you keep that sort of equity or that purchasing power in the bank for the next one.
How about you, Cate?
Nugget, it's all about rail amenity, and we have a lot of people that say, well, it doesn't really faze me, or I'd never catch a train anyway, or I'm happy to drive. We need to think about what our town planners are thinking about, and that is our future. We've got large numbers of new arrivals coming into Melbourne, and that is scheduled for forever, as far as we can see out into time. And our new arrival rate isn't keeping up. I'll start that again. Our road construction rate isn't keeping up with our new arrival and city expansion rate, and that's a real issue. Our city has horrendous driving conditions, particularly at peak. We used to laugh about Sydney traffic, but I debate that Melbourne is not more favourable. And getting around via PT is going to become more and more important as the years and the decades unfold. So I would encourage investors to think about that amenity, because I think from a future point of view, it gives you a level of insulation with your asset that a lot of other attributes may not have the same degree of benefit in terms of your capital growth prospects.
Good one, Cate. I think we've covered a broad diverse of topics really today, haven't we, with our great 2 listener questions. So thanks again to Marilyn and Hunter. We really appreciate your questions, and to our listeners, keep the questions coming. We do have a good backlog of questions, and we try to get around to everybody's if we can. So until next time, we'll see you all, and both of you too, next week.
See you next week.